We're gonna have the best looking
graph
in town, Russ. I've always wanted to do this.
It's a lot of
nodes.
Dad.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's a lot of work too, but if I'm out in the cold and I'm committed to decorating the house, I'm gonna do it right, and I'm gonna do it big. You want something you can be proud of, don't you?
Yeah, I guess so.
Sure you do.
I think you might be overdoing it.
Johnny.
Russ, when was the last time I overdid anything? Come on, unravel these. You have to check every bulb. Whoops, got a little knot here. Work on that. I'll get the other box.
All right, well, happy holidays, everyone. We did it. We're at the end of the year. Hope everyone's preparing for some fun, especially now that we're done with November, which took a lot out of me. I know for my part, I'm still busy kind of in the designer workshop, and I've been cooking up this goofy Christmas material for all of you as sort of a kind of a parting gift for the end of the year. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. Actually, it was a ton of fun. It was super engaging. There was a lot of fun stuff to figure out. And I actually think it does a good job of covering some areas of designer that I think people tend to shy away from, especially when they're new. There's a lot of those areas, I think, but the two in particular I'm talking about are exposing parameters and passing that through the graph, as well as just simple stuff in the function graph. Also, I think using a lot of those really cool path and spline nodes that they're relatively new to designer. I think they came out in like 2022, maybe something like that, 2021. And I love them. I use them right from the jump. They're really cool. But particularly the function graph stuff, like I came to them fairly late. Like when I was learning designer at the beginning, I wish I had started doing them sooner. I sort of put them off because they were a little scary to me, and they're like, there's some math going on, and I don't really want to do that. I want to just, stick with colors. I want to make art, and I wish I had done it sooner because you can do some really fun stuff with it. And they're pretty easy to understand, especially if you approach them slowly and with simple stuff at first. And so that's what this graph is all about, really. I think we ended up making the light strands themselves using the path and spline nodes specifically. There's a lot of ways you could do this, but I thought this would be a really good example to show off the paths and splines. And honestly, it may have been one of the best ways to do it, to be perfectly honest. As well, when we did that and we're passing information through all the stuff in this graph, we had to do some stuff with exposed parameters and passing them through, like passing different information through the different graphs. That became really important to be able to kind of build in an intelligent way. We were also able to do some extra stuff with some really cool blending, because to get that effect of all of these cables here stacking one on top of each other, we had to come up with a pretty, like an interesting way of blending these essentially. Like we can't just use a stock max blend mode to do this because we would have intersections and stuff like that. And that's something that plagues a lot of materials like this, where you get a lot of elements intersecting. And we wanted to make sure that we had this look as clean as possible. So we actually ended up building like a custom layer blender here to handle that for us. So that talks to some custom expression stuff too in the function graphs. And it lets us just get into some more kind of out of the box stuff that is not in a typical graph for most people, I think, but it should be, because this stuff is really doable if you approach it, like I said, in something relatively simple. Today, we're going to walk through the already completed graph, and I'll explain my thought process along the way for sure, and make a point of picking out the stuff I find particularly interesting, and we'll do kind of like side tutorials, like the usual stuff we do. If you would like a complete node by node real-time walkthrough of me building the entire material from scratch, I have that posted on the Patreon. You can see that in the description below. You can see it on the YouTube landing page. You can go over there if you'd like. That's a 6-hour video series. I think it's in 4 video parts, I think, when we do them in little sections. And I've also included on there the SBS file to the graph. So if you can follow along if you'd like. I know for me, like that tends to be helpful to be able to actually like walk along with the graph and the video and help me see all the little specific bits. If you want a more hand-holdy experience, I would head over there. It's also a really great way to support the channel. I really appreciate it. That support really does help me continue to make these sort of larger, more exhaustive pieces of tutorial content, which take a long time to put together. So I really appreciate the support. As well, actually, on the Patreon, for non-paid subscribers, I've put up a 5th video about this where we just go and build the blinking lights in Unreal. And it needn't be Unreal, basically any material software you'd be wanting to make, like if you were in Unity or like whatever, Shader Forge, whatever you're doing, you'd probably be able to use that as well. But it's just a quick thing on how to make those little blinking lights. And that's just available to everyone. So if you just want to check that out, you can just feel free to hop on by and give that a look. But yeah, I really appreciate the support because it does help me able to continue to make this stuff, which is, I hope, really, really helpful. So that all out of the way, let's go open our presents. Let's get to the graph and sort through this thing. All right, so right away, let me fix my hat here. There we go. You'll notice that there's a lot of different stuff going on in here. This graph can, like always, seem complicated. I promise it is not as bad as it looks. I think we did a pretty good job of keeping this pretty tidy and organized to make it fairly legible. Disclaimer, you are going to see some numbers in different settings, like a slope blur's intensity value or a blend mode's blend value. If you are following along trying to like punch those numbers in like exactly, I wouldn't worry about that too much. A lot of the numbers aren't there for a very specific reason. And if they are, I will let you know. But it's not about having the exact right numbers, right? It's just kind of the theory of how these things are put together. The numbers are going to be very different depending on the look you're trying to get. So there's 4 graphs here that all do special things. And you can see them all. This is 2 of them. This is our cable generator and our cable layer blender I mentioned in the intro. So we're going to start with those ones and walk through, because what we're really trying to accomplish in this first bit is just have these cables blend in sort of an interesting way. So we're going to start with that first. And I've turned all the emission off on the bulbs, but we'll come back and turn that all on later. So the way we did this, again, working big to small, it's always good, right? So I started with the cable generator itself. This just builds our initial cable shape. And so the way I did this was actually using these spline nodes, which I think are really great. So the way this worked really was to create a shape. And we'll just talk about this kind of section here. And what you can do is take any mask like this. So in this case, we took a circle and used the mask to path. So you just plug in a shape to this, like a mask, I suppose, like a black and white shape. You plug that into the mask to path, and this turns your mask into paths, not surprisingly. So by default, you have this preview view if you've never opened these nodes before. And this shows you kind of the line. If you had multiple shapes, there'd be multiple colored paths in here. Like if you had something like this, like a cloud where you had multiple separate islands, it's kind of, you can think about it kind of like a flood fill node in the sense that it gives you these multiple, so this would give you many different paths for every possible shape. You can also see that if you decimate this more, it simplifies it, and the lower this number is, the more accurate it's going to be to the path. And it's going to be more expensive. But that's just what you get for being a lot more accurate with it. We're just doing it to this circle, and that just gives us a single path. And what's cool is this is the preview, but really it's this second node, the path output, that this gets fed into the other path and spline nodes as just kind of info to work on other nodes, right? It's in the same way that flood fill sort of prepares other nodes to work. These nodes are much the same. They prepare other nodes to work. So you can plug this into a path to mask, or path to spline rather. Right, so this takes the path information. Hard to see this, right? None of the outputs on this node are particularly legible, except for this value processor. I guess it's telling you the amount of splines. But this stuff is data that you will plug into something like a scatter on spline grayscale. And what that does, whenever you see me doing that, when I'm plugging in multiple outputs at once, right, I could do this. But if I tap 2, you can see I can change it up here as well on the top of my toolbar. If you switch this to 2 and then you drag these out, it'll move all of them as long as like the inputs and outputs on those nodes are named the same. It knows to connect them. But this just scatters. It's sort of like a tile sampler in a certain way, right? A lot of the settings that are on a tile sampler will be very familiar to you here. There's a lot of just random offset, random scale, scale along path. Like it's stuff that's fairly understandable. But it just takes a shape, in this case a disk, and just spreads them along that input path. And you can change the spacing between them so there's more of them or there's less of them. There's all sorts of different things you can do with it. But we essentially did that. I think I used disks here, or I did use a square. So we'll get a scatter on spline grayscale. And I just used this to create the cable itself. So I wanted very little spacing. And I did set the shape to a square, I believe. A disk probably would have worked just as well. And then we do have some jagginess. And I fixed that by just blurring this a little And then if you histogram scan this, you can kind of, it's almost like using a distance field. Like you get like the average, which tends to be a lot more smooth. Right? The more I blur this, the more even this is going to be. But I thought this was a pretty good starting point for our cable, because then all we did was blur it and we used a curve. So if I skip, we'll put this into a normal for a second, just so we can all see it. Like that. I didn't like, based on our cable, that this was just like, it's a bit of a pyramid, really. Right? Like the cable just jumps up and then down, like almost like an upside, like a triangle. Like I was about to say an upside down V, but a triangle is probably a better way of saying it. But if I load my reference for this, if you look at the cables, always use reference. None of you are good enough to not use reference, including myself, including everyone on planet Earth. You'll see that the cables here, they're sort of like a bracket. Like they're more kind of squared off and rounded. These ones are perfectly spherical, or a sphere cross section. They're a circular thing. But I liked these cables where they kind of like rose up and they were flat for a bit and then dumped down again. So to change that, I just grabbed a blur to soften this a little, and then used a curve to change the profile of that. So it was a lot more like the cable's curve, like this. So it's a bit flatter at the top. You can see I'm basically drawing it here, like stay flat and then slope down, as opposed to being like a pyramid. It just rises from black to white. This just fits the shape I'm looking for a bit better on that curve. And then just to tighten the bottom up a bit, because this is a little messy, I just pulled the level in on a black node here, just to tighten the bottom. You can see as I just pull it in on a level. And I think that works great as just our cable. And now, obviously, this is like perfectly circular. It's a bit more obvious if you have it on like a rounded cube. And I wanted to approach doing all those layers of cables. Like, I didn't want to think about them all like kind of lining up and joining and doing all of the special stuff. Because I think a better way to kind of achieve that sense that there's a knot going on is just to make these relatively simple shapes, like the circle or whatever, and then just stack a bunch of them. And once you've stacked enough of them and blended them all on top of each other, it gets this sense that they're more complicated than they are. Like it looks like they're interweaving and like S-curving around, but they actually aren't. It's just a bunch of circles, essentially, just stacked on top of each other, and it kind of adds that complexity over time. So you can kind of, as a preview, you can just put these in a splatter circular grayscale. Right? And you can see if I just switch this is a tile generator, except all of the things are kind of oriented around a center origin, and they rotate around it. This is useful for all sorts of stuff. But I'm going to put the radius random on really high, right? Just to scatter these everywhere. And if you scale these up enough, right? And you have enough of these, it eventually does start feeling like a big tangle of knots, even though it's just a bunch of individual circles. And this is improved a lot by doing what we did here, where we actually warped the shape a bit so that it wasn't a perfect circle. So if we were to replace this here, this feels even better, right? Now that our cable isn't a perfect circle. And then we could do stuff on this splatter circular, like add some random rotation to these things so that they're not all exactly in the same spot. And this begins to feel quite a bit like a knot, right? And the more you add, the more it feels like a knot, kind of like real life, I guess. So that's how we made our cable shape. The other thing I thought that was important to do was this splatter on spline circular is making our cable shape, right? Our initial, the actual cord itself. I just duplicated it and kept this one really, really thin, blurred it a little, and gave it the same amount of warp as the one above us so they line up. And I minned them across each other to create this sort of this intersection between them. Because if you look at the cables in the reference, I saw that a lot of the cables, some of them had more than others, right? But it's clear that there's multiple wires in here that the sheath is across. And I wanted to create that divot. Like these ones just have like the one, I think. The one big main one, this trough. But you'll see that the trough sort of appears and then disappears as it twists, right? And then appears on the other side again. So it kind of appears and disappears on the cable. So you could do that with, there's a really complicated way to do that a bit more accurately, but I didn't want to do it for this one. You have to like create sections and apply twists to them. I did something similar for the tentacles in my, the eyeball tentacle thing. I had to make those tentacles be able to twist and have tentacles on the bottom and on the top. Eric Wiley made a really good tutorial on how to do that. You could do that here, but it doesn't work out as good. And it's just a little bit too complicated, I think, for this. So I think actually this works fairly well. All I did is I have the initial shape, and then I have this version, which is warped slightly more. And because it's warped slightly more, the shape is a little bit more disturbed, right? Like if we use the exact same warp as I did, so what was the strength? The strength is 1.11, this one's 3.54. If I make them exactly the same, it's okay. The only problem is the cable like goes right down the middle. So we go here. I didn't like that the cable in this case goes, what intensity is this? This is 8. This is 8 as well. 3.54, 3.54, but same thing. I don't like that it'll just appear right along the middle. So instead I used slightly different warps, right? I used a different Perlin noise than this one and a slightly more intensity. And that actually causes it, right? If we just turn the strength to just to 0, it follows it perfectly. It doesn't show you that they have those kind of twists, but if you add a bit more warp to this one, it kind of falls off in certain areas, like over here. So it appears and disappears. And that gives you at least a kind of convincing illusion that the cable itself is twisting, which adds, I think, a lot. But I basically did that. And then all of this stuff, the reason why this is happening, and we'll deal with all of the below part of this graph, we can deal with later because it's sort of important later. Really right now, all we're focusing on is making this initial cable. And what I'm doing here is, this is just some debug stuff where we were debugging the different patterns. You'll see that later. The other important thing we wanted to do here is do the splatter circular within this graph. I didn't want to take this graph and spit out a bunch of different single cables and plug them into a splatter circular outside of this graph, just because the blending is not going to work well. That's where our kind of custom blending mode I was talking about comes into play. Like if we were just splattering all of these inside this graph, they just don't blend really well. Right, so if we go back to our thing here and we give ourselves some more and put the radius random up and just kind of spread these all over the place, make them a bit bigger. You can add random luminance and stuff to this. That's fine, but it's not really going to blend very well. So if you do this, right, and we leave it on a max blending mode, this doesn't blend great, right? Because we just get all these like gross, like this stuff feels really bad, right? It looks really cheap when we get all these like kind of gross intersections here. So we'd like to avoid that if possible. So what I did instead was just say, okay, well, hey, why don't we have this graph, our cable generator? It'll just make one, right? So we'll just make one pattern. And as this graph seeds, right? As this thing actually, we get random seeds of this whole graph. We'll get random positions for that cable. And the whole graph will just put out a cable. And then outside of this graph, we'll blend a bunch of them together. You'll see what I mean. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this just puts out a mask of our height map, which is in the red channel of this packed texture. You'll see we actually packed some other textures into this. This is the text that goes along the side of the wire. And so you can see these cables have these wires, like they have these like, I think it just must be like safety notation or just like electrical information about the wire. But I think it's a really fun detail. So we just duplicated that splatter along path, exact same one as these are, that made the actual cable. But in here, we just plugged in some text I found a cool font that I think imitates these pretty well. It looks like it's like a dot matrix. It must be very, very small, right? So just tiny little dots to make it. But we went like brand, Johnny nodes, and then just some random numbers. I think this is the gauge of the wire, I think 24 gauge. And then this is probably something to do with the temperature it can work at and the style it is or whatever. But and trademark. We just plugged those in. And that allowed us to get these cool sections of text along the wire, right? And the way we got the text to line was we did have to play with some stuff on the spline grayscale here. We had to change the end, right? Because if you start at 0 and 1, they'd be really spread out along that path. So I moved the end to the point where they're in just one part of it, right? They're one after the other. They're not like fully spread out along the wire. So that's a fun trick you can do. So we did that as a mask in the green channel because we might want this for texturing later. And then in the blue channel, I have this just anisotropic noise essentially, right? So this is just like a linear, a noise that has a very strong direction to it that just like follows the cable. Because I think this also will go really well to be used in texturing to just kind of create some striations along the cable, which you can see in the reference in places like, you know, up here. And there's these kind of like long strips where, especially where the highlight is broken up, there's just this sort of like anisotropy. So that's what these are for. And they ended up coming in real handy. So at the end of the day, this cable generator puts out a height map. It puts out this text that we might want later and the anisotropic noise. The way this was made was just to take anisotropic noise, use this Cartesian to polar node, which takes those Cartesian coordinates and converts them into polar coordinates so that it like whirls around the center. And then I applied the same vector morph to them that is applied to the shape, right? So that this turns into this. So will this turn into this so that they follow along perfectly. Then all these splatter circulars just match. The splatter circular for the height map, splatter circular for the text, splatter circular for that anisotropic noise, just so that they all blend in correctly. And that's what this graph puts out. What we do then is we go back into the full graph, and what you'll see is I just have a ton of these here. I think we have 17 of them. And these are all the exact same graph, just with a different random seed. Right? So you can just drag that generator into this graph. And as I hit this button, which is relatively new too, I think. I don't think this button is very helpful. I think it's only been the last couple of years. But you can hit this, and this just gives me different versions of the cable. Right? The text is in different places. It rolls off it slightly differently, which is a really cool effect where it kind of hides. Some of them are a lot less visible than others. We can change the cable length too, which is fun. Right, in the way we've changed the cable length is in the cable generator. What's controlling the length of the cable is basically the size of this shape, right? Because the bigger the shape gets, the bigger the path gets, and then the longer the spline gets, which creates a longer cable. So to make it so that's controllable on the parent graph, what you have to do is take this scale thing and expose it, the scale parameter here, and expose it as an exposed parameter to the parent graph itself. So if you right click on this or just left click and go to expose as new graph, and you call this like, for us, because this already is exposed, we'll call this like circle size, just so you can see it. I can't spell. There you go. Circle size. And I'm just going to make an output node just so that we can see what's going on there. You'll see that now that I've exposed that size parameter, I can't change it on this node anymore. That's because I've promoted it to the graph itself. So if I double click anywhere in the graph or click on the graph in my Explorer window here, if I scroll down, I'll see it. That's this circle size. And you can switch the label. I would also keep the label circle size as well. But now if you hop out of this graph back to a graph that has this one in it, into our main Xmas project one, you can see that if you pull this guy out, he actually has that parameter exposed to him. So we can change him outside of the graph, right? So that's a real key thing that's going to happen a lot in this graph, is just exposing the parameters so that they're adjustable outside of the main graphs. But we just have a bunch of these. coming out everywhere. And then what it became about was just how do you blend these on top of each other? Because the problem is if you just use the normal blending, right? I'll get a blend mode and our height maps are stored in I'm getting an RGBA split node. The height maps are stored in the red channels of these guys. So if you were to just blend these, the max lighten does not work very well, right? This doesn't work so hot. So if you want to just preview this blending here, I can make a dot node here and just call it, we'll call it temp height tut. And then down here, I'll make another node dot, and we'll select temp height tut. And this is just so that I can like skip all the other stuff. Just so we can like see as we're working through the different examples, skip all the other stuff. So you can see this blending just doesn't work very well. So what we did to actually do this blending properly was we need to like, basically a good way of thinking about it, if we just go to a sphere for a second, and we turn up our tessellation and all that fun stuff, so we actually have some displacement going on. Turn the height scale up, tessellation up. What we would like to have happen is these cables are a set height, but we want this one to jump on top of the other. So what you can do is basically we want this one to get taller when it intersects this one, so that it actually goes like this and then hops over top of it. So what you can do is blur this bottom one, right? And then add that blur to the top one, right? Now, this works okay, but the problem is we don't want it to be added out here, right? So what we can do is take this guy and histogram scan him so that we have a mask of where he is or where he isn't, and use him as the mask for that add, right? So we're adding those two on top of each other, but the add should only occur on that mask, like this. So you can see this guy now just like bumps up slightly where this guy is going to go below him. And now if we add this, he slides underneath him, right? That cable gets taller right when he intersects him, right? So the blending is a lot nicer, essentially, right? Because the cables are the same height. There's no reason for them not to be, right? With the random lumens in a tile sampler, some are getting lower, some are getting higher, and it's like they might intersect. But this one, they're all the same height, but when they happen to intersect, it just jumps up and over. So this trick is used all over the place in this graph. That's essentially what these cable layer blenders are. So if you open up a cable layer blender, this is just our custom blender we built. So over here, I have these debug graphs. Like this graph takes some inputs, the new layer and the input layer. If I redirect these here for a sec, we'll be able to see how this works. And these are some debug things out here. So everything in here is exactly what I just showed in the other graph. It's just taking one layer, blurring it, adding it to the other layer with a mask so that they jump up over top of each other, right? So you can see I took the top layer, blurred it, auto leveled it. And then this guy is the overall cable length. So he's actually exposed. This white level is exposed. And he's what I call the overall cable height. So you can see if you go to the level out high on this levels, he's been exposed and it's just called cable height. And that means I can go anywhere on the graph here and change the cable height of all of the cables. And anything that's cable height related will just move automatically, which is really nice. Keeps the height levels consistent across every cable. So auto level it, that adjusts the height. Then we did the exact same thing I was doing outside. right? The other layer is blurred and added to the subsequent layer. So this layer hops up on top of the layer below it. And then after we've done that blend, we create some masks, right? So whenever you're trying to get the difference of a layer, right, we want an ID for both cables here. You just take one layer and subtract, like I take the final layer, like the result of the max blend mode usually, and then subtract the layer that came before it. And that gives you an intersection. We've done this in a lot of our tutorials. And this creates a mask for the bottom cables separate from the top cables. We can do all sorts of fun stuff with that. And in this case, what we were using them for was a mask to blend over our different textures, right? Because these cable generators aren't just the height map, it's also our text and our anisotropic noise. So this piece of blending here is blending those color textures, right? This is our text layer and our anisotropic noise from both cables. And this just blends them back on top of each other. So at the end, we have a nice intersection where one goes over top of the other, right? We have the bottom cable's height map and all of its textures. So it's text, texture, and its anisotropic noise. Same with the top cable layer, and they're blended intelligently so that later on, after we've done all of this blending, we're able to pull those masks out and use them for texturing. So these goes out to an output. All this stuff is just a debugger so we could preview stuff working correctly. Right, so we can see our height map blends nicely. There's no gross intersection. They just pass over top of each other when they need to. Then this was just me seeing if the anisotropic noise lined up correctly, which it does. And then the text. And that's a really cool effect, right? When you get this working, it's always really, really exciting. Because the text will just go here. It disappears where it needs to. It's really fun. So all this guy does is take two cable layers, cable generators, and blends them properly. And in the main graph, that's all we have going on. We just have a huge section of that. We have a ton of them being joined together. It's just cable generator goes into the new layer, new cable generator goes into the new input, and then the output of that one goes into the input of the next one, and the new layer goes into new. The output of this one goes into the input of the next one, the new layer goes into the new input layer. And we just chain all of these together. And the result is that we slowly add more and more of them. So it's sort of like doing a splatter circular, but one sheet at a time. Because we're able to control the blending much better and have it have that fun intersection where the cables hit and then just jump over without having those gross intersections. So you can see by the end, you can get rid of all this stuff. And we'll pull this guy down here. And you'll see by the end, we have this huge stack of it. So remember, he's in the red channel, the height map is. So you can see we're just slowly stacking it. And they do a really good job of going like, this one's on the bottom, this one's on top of that one, but this one's on top of that one, right? So they really do kind of like zigzag over top of each other in a really nice kind of coherent way. We're just adding more and more and more. At some point, I feel like I had enough. Right, this was, I think, 17 layers or something like that. And then we did this fun trick where we basically did the exact same blending math here, but we did it on an entire layer, right? So we took our final cable layer here and then just transformed it to get a slightly different version of it. Right, so it's the same layer, but it's just moved a little bit with a transform, moved out of the way. And I blended those height maps on the exact same way, where I take one layer and blur it, subtract or add it to the layer beneath it, and then blend them on top of each other. Right, so we go from having, this is the exact same math that was happening in the cable generator layer. But what happens here is, instead of going like single circular cable over single circular cable, we've done this field of circular cables and we're blending an additional field on top of it. So it's just a way of speeding the graph up because we don't need like 82 cable generators, right? We only need the 17. And then if we blend that layer twice, we have 34. And if we blend it again, we have 68, right? And it just allows us to like quickly build that up. That's all of what these sections are doing. Cable layer 2 gives us this. We have way more. And then we have some like albedo texture stuff happening in the way here, which doesn't look so great. That's just the, we're seeing the emissive mask here. You don't have to worry about that though. You can just go like here. That's fine. So here we have the 34 layers. Right, once we've blended in this whole cable layer 2. Then underneath the cable layer 2, this is just where we're doing the exact same thing of blending our masks on top of each other. Right, where you want those texture masks to blend. The exact same idea. Everything that's happening out here, cable layer 2 blend, cable layer 2 texture blends, is the exact same thing that's happening in the cable layer blend. Identical. It's just instead of doing them in the blender, which we're doing, 17 times, one for each cable generator, in the main graph, we're just doing it once out here to blend the two actual 17 item layers over top of each other. And after we've done that, we do it again. So this whole thing, this is exactly the same as this. And in fact, there's an argument for making it another, you could turn that into its own graph as well if you wanted to, like an external cable blender or whatever. But I wanted to do some slightly different things here. And this blends even more, right? You can see the blending still works really well. They just kind of pass over top of each other. And behind the hood, all of the masks are coming for the ride as well. Right, our text masks and our anisotropic noise masks are just coming along with us, which is great. And then I think we just did a third layer here to add even more. Right, so now we're at a point where this feels like it's very, very tangled, right? That you have like a ton of different layers interacting with themselves here. And it's not because we built some really crazy knot material or something. It's just that once you blend enough of these just relatively circular paths on top of each other, it really does give you the vibe that you're really, really complicated knot, but it isn't. After that, we went down and thought about, let's build the lights, right? So this is how we got these guys, our actual light bulbs. So they're really fun. This is its own graph, the light bulb strand generator. And really this top socket or this top node here is just making the socket. So this is fairly simple. We just got a cylinder, use a tile generator. You'll see me do this all the time as a trick where I just get a tile generator. And instead of using a transform grayscale, I just set this to 1 and 1, an image input. And I'm able to just scale this down, offset it. If I want to stretch it a bit wider, I can go up to this. So it's just, I find this, you'll see me do this a lot. I think it's nicer than using a transform 2D often. Blurred a little, used a level, and then I used a vector morph to just like flare the edges out. This in the Patreon we explain very thoroughly because I don't think people use vector morph enough. But it's very, very cool. You can do fun stuff like this. But there's a lot of ways you could achieve this. And that just makes our socket. We take these little shapes. I noticed in the reference that they have these little ridges. So I just took a tile sampler grayscale set to, it's like 16 of them by 1. And then I blurred them and just subtract them slightly. So we get these little ridges in the height map. And that makes our actual light socket. The bulb was really fun too. We had to use a vector morph again. We didn't have to, but it was the easiest way to make this shape. Right? If you want to do a quick walkthrough of how the vector morph thing works here, a way to think about it is the morph is going to pull in 2 different directions, or as many different directions as you want. So you have to plug in a vector 3 into this. Well, vector 2, really. If you have grayscale plugged into both R and G, this won't move at all. So the higher the grayscale value in the red channel of this vector field, the more the texture is going to move negative X. Or the more it's going to move positive X, right, horizontally. And the thing plugged into the green channel controls the vertical motion. So we just wanted to go, hey, we really want the bottom of this shape, the cylinder, to flare out. So what we'll do is take a gradient and plug that into the horizontal component. With the vertical component, we don't want to move ever. It's going to stay middle gray. But you'll see this stretches and squashes it as I change the intensity of the morph. Right? Because this side is pulling this way and the other side is pulling the opposite way. So it's pulling it apart. We just don't want it to pull apart at the same rate at the whole texture. We don't want the bottom part to move at all. So we can just take our gradient and blend on the grayscale, like middle gray, which doesn't warp at all. And then just histogram scan this. And I'll probably make a quick video on vector morph in general at some point. But if we do this, we're only turning it on up top. Right? And a negative number would push it the other way. Right? Because up here in the red channel, we're going to move negative X. Here, we're going to move positive X. But down here, we're not moving at all because it's where we've blended over the middle gray. And then this histogram scan just becomes the point at which the warping begins. So hopefully that helps. I think the vector morph probably deserves its own video at some point. But I did the exact same thing with the bulb here to kind of flare it out in this specific area. Blurred it, histogram scanned it to smooth it out, beveled it, auto level, curved it to make it a bit more round. And that's our bulb shape, really. And over here, we're using the exact same, we're using a cable generator, right? Because we want to instance, just like we were instancing the text along the path to spline, we want to do the same thing with the light bulb shape. So that's what we do there. We just plug in, I wanted the sockets to be separate from the bulbs because I need to do some blending with them in the other graphs. So these use the same path data as one of our cables. So we actually needed to make sure our cable generator could, this graph, right, that makes the cables themselves, that it could output all of this spline data so that they were accessible in the light bulb node generator. So I had to make some output colors and output all of the special nodes here. The spline chords, the spline data, and the spline amount. And that was just so that they'd be accessible outside of this graph, because I need them to use another use another scatter on spline grayscale node in the light bulb strand generator, right? That's why our cable generator outputs all of these. And I actually made it so that you can turn these on and off. Right, you'll notice that the cable generators that are in the main Xmas project graph, they don't export the spline data as a default, just to make it a bit tidier. Right? So I just have this on a switch so that they can turn on and off. And that switch looks really simple. You just have to make in your input parameter, so double click anywhere on the graph and hit this plus button and you can make a Boolean. And I just called this, a Boolean is like a light switch. It's just true or false, right? Should you do something or should you not do something? Turn on the light, turn off the light. And I called this like export spline data or whatever. And what you do to make these visible is you have to copy this little string. So on those outputs I built, you have to have this string that says input open bracket equals the name of that Boolean, close quotation, close bracket, equals true, visible if. So that's what turns those outputs on or off, which just helps keep the graph tidier. But in the light bulb strand generator, we use that data, right, the spline data, to place these bulbs and sockets along the same curve as the cable. And these ultimately will be blended together, but I wanted them separate in here. outside of this graph, you could just max these all on top of each other. And you can see they all line up nice. But for reasons that'll become clear after this, I wanted to have this blending happen outside of this graph, which is a little weird, but we needed it in order to create nice masks. So that's the light bulb generator. That's our 3 graphs, our special graphs, our cable generator, our light bulb strand generator, and our cable layer blender, our special blender. But after that, I just make a light bulb strand by pulling in our light bulb strand generator. Right, we have a mask for the cable, for the sockets, for the bulbs, and then our textures for the bulbs. Right, because we still want that text in our anisotropic noise texture. We still need those in order to make them make sense in the final graph. And then what we're doing here is I'm building a layer. Let's get our temporary final height. What I wanted to do here is put a bunch of the light bulbs underneath the cables. Because if I looked at the reference, a lot of the times the bulbs were underneath a ton of cables and sometimes they're on top. So this first thing here was just to put bulbs underneath our main cable layer. So I'm just turning up our tessellation and stuff so it looks nicer. You can see this is kind of cool. They look like they've just been sitting there like mice in a blanket or something. But they're really cool. The way I did this is I just took our final cable layer, right, that we had generated up here. I took our light bulb strands and added them to that cable layer so that they get taller where the lights will eventually be. And then I blended the cables on with like a max blending mode. And then the sockets get blended on with a max blending mode. And then the light bulbs get blended on with a max blending mode. And ultimately, once I auto level it, we have them all together. So you can see the light bulb kind of peeking out from underneath the cables, which is a really neat effect. The reason why I'm blending them on cable first and then socket first and then light bulb last, or sorry, I should say I blended them on cable first, socket second, light bulb last, is that over here, I'm generating masks because eventually I'm going to need a mask for where all the cables are, for where all the sockets are, and for where all the bulbs are so that we can do special stuff with it later. So here, this is where I blended the cables on. So if I need to make a mask of where that happened, I just take the final result, subtract the input that came before it. And if we histogram scan this gives me a mask of where that cable is visible, the cable that these guys are attached to. And I did the same thing for, this is where the sockets get blended on. So here's where the sockets get blended. The layer that came before them is this one. And this is where the sockets are. So we only see little bits of it. And then the same thing here, where we did, here's where the bulbs go on. So we plug him into the bottom. And then whatever came before it. And this is where all the bulbs are. And what's nice about doing this is I can put a portal node out here. And I called this one Mask Cables Working 01. And the reason I'm doing this is later on, it's really helpful because at each stage here, we're going to make adjustments to that mask. And I want to make sure that they just carry on throughout the whole graph. So this is the cable working 01, the socket working 01, bulb working 01, and our mask texture blends that are happening along with it. After that, I wanted to put some bulbs right on top of everything. So I made a new light bulb generator, moved it a little just to have it in a slightly different spot. And then for this one, I did the reverse. I blended everything together and then multiplied it away to make kind of like a dip for where that bulb is going to get laid on top of. So the whole texture dips down and the bulb kind of sits right on top of it to try to get rid of intersections. So it ends up looking like this. Again, just as a reminder, if some of this is going a little too quick, I did wanted to keep this kind of short for YouTube and just give a quick review. if you want an entire thing, you can check out the Patreon. Like I said, it is like a node by node rebuild of the whole thing. And I think that can be like the most helpful for actually seeing like the real specifics if you're newer to this stuff or feeling a little lost. And then we just blend the bulbs and the light bulb sockets back on top of that dark area we just created. So we get rid of a lot of that gross intersection. And then these are the exact same things as these are. So I'm taking the layer where I blended on the cable, subtracting the layer that came before it, scanning it, and then I'm adding this to the mask cables working 01, which just came up here. I'm adding the new cable, and now I'm sending out to call it mask cable working 02. So you can see that at the end of the day, I have mask bulbs working 01 through 03. I have sockets working 1 through 3, and then there's finals too. There's like a final socket, final texture, but that just allows me to keep the graph really tidy and kind of just work on those masks as I pass through the graph. So that's all the masks, right? So we have our sockets, like our new sockets we just added to the old ones that are hidden underneath the cables. Same thing here, our new light bulbs added to the light bulbs that are underneath the cables. And then after we had put these bulbs on top, I wanted to put a layer of cables over top of them. So we're basically going like bulbs, big layer of cables, more bulbs, and then another layer of cables to try to create that sense of depth and like a lot of stacked things one after the other. That's a huge part of the look here. So you can see by here, I have another layer of cables that just passes over top of everything, which is really fun. So this is very similar to the blending we were doing into the cable layer generator, right? Where we're just taking one layer, adding to the layer coming next. And then because we're bumping that layer up, we can slide stuff in beneath it. So I just grabbed a new, this is a couple cable generators. This isn't as many as we used up here. I think it's only like, I don't know, I think it's maybe 15 or something like that. But this just creates a bit of a thinner layer. I thought that this was enough. And we take this, blur it, and we subtract that from our texture so that this creates a nice depression to lay the cables on top of. And you can see these cables needed to get taller where a light bulb was going to be. So here's the light bulbs that got laid on top, these guys. I'm just giving them a little bit of a blur and adding them to this new cable layer so you can see where they are. The cable is going to get taller so that they're able to pass right over top of them. Right? So where the bulb is, the cable actually gets a bit taller. So it just conforms to the surface really well. We end up with this great looking example here where the cables actually are pretty normal height, but then they get taller right when they need to pass on top of the light bulbs. And then we have the same thing here where we're just editing those masks. We want to add the new cables, but the cables crisscross that light bulb, right? We wouldn't want this. We need them to be crisscrossed by the new bulbs, the new cables that are now overlapping them. And then the last thing we did here was just build some bulbs that are upright. So these are bulbs that are pointing like directly off the surface. We can't see the socket or anything because they're hidden underneath all of the cables. So this is just a bulb that comes straight out from the surface. And it's basically just a parabola, really. But I think this also adds a ton because you can see we get these bulbs that jump right up off the surface. Right, so they're a bit of a different orientation. And if we turn the tessellation up, like turn the scale of the height map up, you'll see it a bit clearer. We need this to be quite a bit higher. But I think this adds a lot of variety. So instead of the bulbs all being kind of like flat to the surface, at least a couple of them point directly out. And I think that adds a lot to just make it feel a bit more varied. And that was our final height map, really. Texturing this was really, really simple because all we had to do, I'm going to hook this back up to our final height. Like this. This was the final height map. Making the textures for this was relatively easy. All we had to do is I picked a base color for the cables. Is kind of just like, you always want to work big to small, even when you're working with color, right? You want to start with the big, obvious color shapes and then slowly work smaller, like color frequencies. So it's just a green. I desaturated a little bit and blended on this directional, just this warped cloud texture, just to give it a bit of breakup on the cables. So some are a bit more like worn. But this is where all the really fun stuff happens. This is our texture blends that we've been passing through the whole graph. So we have our texts, our anisotropic noises. So here, I just took our anisotropic noise and just subbed it a little. And this adds these little striations along the cables. Right? So you can see why it's really good that earlier on in the cable generator itself, we went through the trouble of building that. Because it does add a ton of cool variety here and really does help separate the cables quite a bit. And then we got to put the text on. And this is really cool. Right? It's so sweet where you see it come together here. And you can see all the little text running on all the cables. And they cover each other perfectly because we did all that special blending in the cable blender that allowed them to overlap each other well. And then we took the socket mask. So this is where all of our sockets are. So this is why it was so nice for us to build all of these pale boxes, right? The pale white boxes are all the mask generators just slowly being added to. And what's so great here is at the end, we can just use that cable socket generator to pick out all the sockets. And I just chose to make them a little bit of a darker green, just so they stand out more. Right? And then the bulbs themselves. So I have that final bulb mask, right? Mask bulb final. That's once we had finished adding on all the bulbs, including the upright ones. And that allows us to just I put like a very dark color. The glass is pretty dark to get our bulbs themselves on. And then I just laid an ambient occlusion on top of everything to make the further back layers feel darker. In the Patreon tutorial, we actually did an additional step here where we made a special mask that makes each cable darker the further back it goes. And that allowed us to use some like value processors and some really fun stuff in the expression graph. So if you're interested in that, that's a fun one. It's it's a little bit more complicated. We get to use a value processor and some expression graph stuff. And I think it's in a very simple way that's approachable. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out the Patreon. I really think people would benefit from seeing that ran through. Because it is very helpful and like value processors can be really, really strong. That did our base color though. The roughness was really simple. We just took, and we'll just plug this in so we can see it. This is quite simple. It's just some generic noise. This is that same moisture noise we used to make the cables a little bit more pale here. We're using it here just to make it a bit more rough. Where we had the anisotropic noise, I sub that in just so we have some striations up close. It's cool. We get these sort of like anisotropic highlights, which feel really nice. And we got to put on our text. And I just thought the text would maybe be a bit smoother because it's almost like an ink maybe. So it's like a bit of a smoother color or a smoother ink. And that gives us this little slight highlight on the text, which I think works really well. It adds like a nice little pop. And then I added just a white noise everywhere just to create I saw in the reference that a lot of the times that plastic looked like it had a bit of a I think it's probably like a releasing agent from when these are molded, but it's got this kind of really fine powdery detail. And I wanted to imitate that in the roughness map. So that's where that came from. And then for the bulbs, they should be really dark, right? They should be really, really smooth so that they become reflective. And then that way I'm able to just add a bit of breakup to them. It's just like a moisture noise getting subtracted onto them just so that there's a bit of breakup. So we have some kind of dirt collecting. And then an AO went on top just so things got a little bit more matte the deeper down they go. Again, in the Patreon video where we have that every cable gets brighter the further back it goes, this mask worked way better. But this will suffice in a pinch, right? The ambient occlusion does a pretty good job. If you don't want to do that, this works fairly well too. the last thing that's what we're talking about is how we made the emissive values. So I'm going to plug our emissive bulbs in if we want those colors. And so it worked slightly differently in Unreal. When I said at the beginning of the video, when I talked about how in the Patreon we have the Unreal setup, it works a little differently for that. We had to make some different masks. But the principle is the same here. All I needed to do to make these is I picked my 5 colors. And these seem to be kind of the standard Christmas light colors. Red, green, magenta, kind of a deepish blue and like a gold, or sort of what I was seeing often. So I decided to just pick those. And we just plug them into this texture where we separate them into 5 sections. And then to actually make the different bulbs, I just grabbed, here's where all of the lower layer bulbs are, right? They come from all the way up in the top of the graph where we made that first layer of light bulbs. I plugged that into a flood fill, then to a flood fill to random grayscale. So this just assigns a random grayscale to every bulb. And then I had to do the same thing with the second layer of bulbs. Right, so these are the bulbs that are on top. That's these ones. Blended them together. And then the emissive bulbs that are upright. They, same thing, get a flood fill to random grayscale, and they get added on. And at the end of the day, I also had to mask out the cables. Right, so that the cables aren't on top of them. And at the end of the day, these get run through a gradient dynamic. So you plug in a gradient here and some colors, and it remaps them. So the different grayscale values choose different areas of color on this texture, and that gives us a different color per light bulb. And that does, and I just wanted at the end here to take that and blend some AO on top of it, just so that the bulbs were darker at the edge and at the base and they were in the middle. Because if you look at the reference, the bulbs are much brighter in the middle where they're closer. The bulb is right there, right? Under, like the light itself is covered by the bulb. It's right in the middle. So that's where it should be the brightest. And at the top and bottom, it should get a bit less bright, which you're seeing here too, right? You can get less, it's less bright there than it is down here where the bulb actually is. And yeah, so that's basically this guy. Like I said, the Unreal setup is slightly different. We need some more textures. So hop on over to that Patreon if you want to check out how that guy was set up. And there we go. Hoping everyone enjoyed that. I had a ton of fun on this one. I hope everyone picked up something interesting. Again, as mentioned, if you would like a more complete overview of this, where we go one node at a time, completely setting by setting, tweaking every knob, I really appreciate you guys heading to the Patreon, throwing me your support there. It really does help me to create these like bigger pieces of tutorial content and just like to put stuff out as often as I possibly can. It's been really nice getting back to it. So get over there. The link is in the description. If you're not in the space to do that right now, totally understand. I appreciate it anyway. If you could like the video, costs you nothing. It really helps me a lot. At a follow would be appreciated. Share it with your friends that are maybe in the process of learning designer. That's also helpful. And I plan on having a lot more new stuff kind of coming through the new year. So thank you guys so much for hanging out for a bit. Like I said, I hope you picked up something interesting. Happy holidays. And we'll see you guys in the new year for all sorts of continued designer fun.